Hello everyone. My name is Rachel Workman, and I'm one of the planning committee members for the Justice Conference this year. I'm just a little out of breath because we were concerned our speaker previously was going over. So I leaned over to apologize to our next speaker, and she said, "Let him go, it's amazing." So I wanted to run up and relay that. But we really do want to give adequate time to our next speaker, who has graciously donated her time as a local voice for justice. Satwinder Bains is founder and director at the Center for Indo-Canadian Studies at the University of the Fraser Valley. She's a long-time advocate of cross-cultural education, and she brings a wealth of experience as a diversity educator, a community developer, and an activist in the areas of women's rights, youth empowerment, immigrant settlement integration, and community engagement. Satwinder is an avid participant in community affairs at both the civic and provincial level. I first met Satwinder in about 2007 when I had the privilege of taking one of her courses at the university. I'm so looking forward to hearing what she has to share with us today, and I'm delighted to introduce her to you now. So please join me in welcoming Satwinder Bains.
Thank you, Rachel. Can you hear me okay? So thank you to Joanne for connecting with me. We tried last year, and I was so out of the country at this time, but again she phoned me this year, emailed me this year and said, "Will you be able to come?" So thank you for inviting me. And thank you to all of you for engaging with me for a short time. And it's hard to follow up when you have people who are trying to abolish slavery in the world and, world vision, and then here I am in a local setting. So I think the global and the local are really important to all of us in this new world that we live in. The world is at our doorsteps. We are able to interact so easily with people across the oceans, which we weren't able to previously. So I think even what we do locally has an impact, a ripple effect in our global world. I just want to start by saying that what you're going to hear from me is just my worldview. Please don't take everything I say to be the worldview of every Indo-Canadian, every South Asian you're going to come across now, from now to in the community. So this is my worldview, this is how I see the world. And this is some of my perspectives that I want to share with you. I come from an immigrant background. As you know, I'm of Indo-Canadian descent. I started to think that my ethnicity is becoming more and more Canadian, and as I lose some of my Indian-ness that brings me to this country. But I'm still quite involved in my community, as Rachel has mentioned, and I'm really interested in Justin's comments about being a solutionist and not just an activist. I do take my role as an activist very seriously, in my community and outside. So I have this dual role that I play. I work within my subcultural community all the time. Amazing. Thank you. Even I can feel it's resounding. So I have this dual role and responsibility that I work within my own subcultural community, and I work with the larger dominant mainstream community and all communities as much as I can, but I'm very careful and I'm very conscious and I'm very aware of my footprint and my thought print and my spheres of influence. We are like onions, all of us. We have a core and then so many layers all around us. And that core influence that I have within my family and my children and my partner and then my extended family and then my subcultural community, and it goes on and on. So I take my activism and I like this new coined word solutionist seriously, and I try very hard not to take a heavy stick and try to affect change. Change is slow, as we all know, but it comes at its own pace, and it comes when people are ready and communities are ready. So I take that with with a lot of caution. So what I'm going to talk about really is about community development, and I'm going to, as the last speaker said, disrupt your life a little bit, to make you check your assumptions and to make you aware of all of us, be included, how we wake up in the morning and how we start our day and what we think about. They say we have, hundreds of thousands of thoughts every day, but only 2% of those thoughts are different. We continue to have the same thoughts and the way we think and the way we interact and what we do with our action, the same as we did yesterday. So to disrupt that a little bit and to think about our assumptions. We all have stereotypes, we all have ways of looking at the world, and we are social in a certain way at home, in the school, in our churches, in our community, wherever we go. The South Asian community is no different. I also like this new words that the last speaker, Mr. Han, said. He said the same kind of different. And what I'm going to share today is really no different from what you probably have experienced as well. The Indo-Canadian community has a little over 100-year-old history in the Fraser Valley, and yet, there seems to be this sense of we've just arrived. I get asked, how long have you been here? How can you speak English? I get asked these questions. There is no historical footprint of our community. Yes, the first group of people that came till about the 1940s, from 1904 onwards to the 40s, was a smaller group of people, and they faced enormous challenges in a very raw country that was being settled. And I use the word settled very cautiously because this was a settled country already. We didn't come as settlers, we came as colonizers to take over another part of the world. So people who lived in the first, from 1904 to 1940s, faced a lot of challenges. And I'm so pleased to say that our evolution as human beings, and in terms of justice, how far we've come from where we were, and how much we have learned and unlearned and changed. So the first cohort of people that came from 1904 to about 1950s faced some enormous challenges. And Abbotsford is a very unique community in the sense that right in the midst of our town on South Fraser Way near Burkhan stands a physical site for us, a site of memory, a site of resistance, a site of permanence, because in the early 1900s we were not welcome in this country, and the common term which we even saw in that video when Martin Luther King was fighting justice, go home. What is home? Where is home? Who lays claim to home? Who decides this is my home and not your home? So those thoughts of, those times of difficulty that they faced created a sense of purpose and a sense of justice. The faith group that I come from, and a large population of my community that lives in Abbotsford comes from a singular faith group, the Sikh faith group. There's a bit of a disconnect between the number of people who are Sikhs in India and the number of Sikhs who are in Canada. So we're only 2% of the population in India, but we're 96% of the population in Canada. So that tells you that there's been this chain migration that continues to happen. So we came as somebody sponsored somebody, and there's this chain link that hasn't broken. So the faith group itself gives us a sense of justice and a sense of fighting oppression and fighting wherever there is oppression, not just within the faith group. So there are these foundational strengths that keep us grounded, that then helped us create a temple in 1908 on South Fraser Way with the help of the Trethewey family, who owned the mill at Mill Lake. And that building, right in the middle of town, really for me resonates in so many ways. It was a place of political struggle. It was a place to show Canadians that no matter that you've taken away my right to vote, you have taken away the right for me to have family, to bring my wife or my children to live with me. You have taken the right away for me to travel between my home, my immigrant home, my country of origin, and my adopted home. Regardless of all that, I'm going to create a place, a permanent place. And the fortitude of that group to do that and to have that kind of courage speaks to issues of justice. And that building is now a few years old, and is the only permanent structure in Americas that is that old and has a National Historic Designation site designation. After the 40s, after the vote was finally given and liberalization occurred of the government policies, from that point on, there's been 3 other cohort groups of people. And so when I work in the field of community development, it's very difficult for me even to do a talk about my community in a very monolithic way, as if homogenous way. There's of course, as you can imagine, so much diversity and so much difference within the community, but I'll give you kind of a overview of where I think you could maybe place your thoughts and your ideas as I share them with you. So there's the first cohort from 1908 to 1904 to 1940s, and they were what we call the pioneers, who came and who settled in a very difficult country without their children, without their families, and mostly a bachelor society. And then after the 40s, after liberalization, 50s, 60s, then there's another cohort group of people, the largest bulge of people who came from the subcontinent of India, and India was made, at that time, Pakistan was part of India as well, and even Sri Lanka, Burma, that whole region, the South Asian region, that cohort group came in the late 60s and 70s. And so they're what we call the pioneering group as well, but in a different way. And then there's the children of those people, and this is the first, second generation cohort of South Asians in Canada that is this large. So those people's children, the ones that came in the 70s, are now a large cohort of second generation Canadians, I would call Canadians. And then of course the fourth cohort is the continuous immigration, as Canada allows people to come into Canada and sustain its economy and its birth and death rate, the new immigrants that keep coming. So in terms of working in the community and doing community development, I'm very aware of these 4 cohorts, and each having their own needs and their own concerns and their own challenges and their own successes. But there are some foundational tenets, and I suppose for faith being one, family being another one, and the third would probably be our work sphere, or what we do in the Canadian world, what we do outside of our home and outside of our work. And I'm pleased to say today there is good integration. You know, the old policy was everybody should assimilate, become like everybody else. But define that, and it's difficult to define, become like whom? And in what way? And how much? And how little? And what do I drop and what do I keep? So there's a constant struggle, I think, from a Canadian context, political context, as well as a cultural context about when do we really belong? When have we really arrived? I had worked with a lot of Vietnamese people when they came in the early 80s from the war. And one of them said very poignantly, he said, you know, I have arrived. I am in Canada. I've come as a refugee, and Canada has been very gracious to me and very kind. But I'm still standing at the door. I haven't actually stepped over the door sill and walked in. And I asked him what that meant, and he said, there seems to be this sense that I haven't really arrived, that I don't have, for example, you know, my English is not that good, I'm still not accepted, I can't find work according to my degree or my qualifications. And he was highly educated. Vietnam was getting rid of all its intelligentsia. And he said, I still feel like I'm standing outside the door. This is now, you know, when he had, about 10 years after he had arrived. And I still feel that we're struggling with this sense of, how do we integrate? What does integration look like? You know, have we gotten rid of the old policy of assimilation? And does it mean that I must, for example, get rid of my accent? You know, people frown on people who have accents. There's even courses on reducing your accent in Canada. It seems to be a difficult challenge for people who speak a certain way, or who, even if they know English, have a different accent. So integration is a continuous journey. It hasn't stopped, will probably never stop. And integration is a two-way dialogue. And I probably want one message I would leave today with you is this concept of the two-way dialogue. There tends to be this sense that the host community can just sit back and watch it unfold. And the onus is on the immigrant community to do everything that they need to do to integrate and to become good citizens, and these model citizens. And I have to say there needs to be a two-way dialogue. There needs to be a host community conversation about expectations and about collaboration, about really understanding, deeply understanding and deeply engaging with people who are coming from other countries, in our neighborhoods, in our communities. I had, many years ago, I had a woman who phoned me and said, this is when I worked in race relations, and she said to me, I live close by to a South Asian family, Indo-Canadian family, and they're very nice, and sometimes I say hello, and sometimes they say hello, and I said, how long have you lived together in the neighborhood? About 10, 12 years, so a fair bit of time. And she says the other day, the lady of the home, she said she came and dropped off a big flat of strawberries. What should I do? And it puzzled me for a minute, because I thought this is it seems to be a commonsensical answer that I can give you, but obviously there needs to be more dialogue, because she's really wondering, is it okay for me to do this or that? And I think she wasn't coming from a place of malice or any kind of misintent. I think her idea was that there's something different about this person and I don't really know, so I must ask somebody else to mediate that for me. And really, what it really, I think, would have opened the doors was just to make us maybe a shortcake and put some strawberries on it and give it back to her, or do something more just around being a neighbor. So there tends to be this, I'm not saying always, but there are barriers to engagement. And we all need to be in this exercise together. So integration is not a one-way street. It is a dual engaged process. And I think today, as for example, I'm here and I'm engaging with you, this is one of those processes. But we need to open the doors to deeper engagements. And I'm not saying that it's not happening. You have examples of people outside who are doing great work, who put up their booths and say, we're reaching out to the communities. I remember watching mental health, and I remember saying, what is your client load? Let's look at your client intake and who comes to mental health services. And really, there was a very small number of people who were coming, in fact, very low number of people who were coming, who were from cultural groups or so-called groups who have English is not their first language. And very interestingly, the services were saying, but we don't discriminate. People can just come. Whoever wants to come, they can come. And nobody had done the environmental scan to say, is it feasible for them to come? Is there something here that will open the door for them? Have you ever looked at that? So that I bring you back to the concept of it is about us, but it is about not us and them. If we can just get to that model of us, the model of we are all in this together, that it is about us. But we do need to understand that when there are barriers, how do we open them or find ways to mediate them? For the Indo-Canadian community, there are a number of challenges, as you can imagine. The same thing about, not very different. We have the same challenges as everybody else. We have a second generation, like I mentioned to you, a group of second generation children who grew up in Canada, who may never have gone to their home country, who may know the language in terms of listening but can't speak it very well, who have second and third, 1 and 2 generations of family members living in the home, in extended family units. And the challenges that they're facing are very much Canadian challenges. And the South Asian families, as they start to integrate and start to figure out Canadian living, are still looking for the new problems that their children are bringing to the table or bringing to the home, old solutions. And those old solutions aren't working. So for us as activists in the community and as solutionists, we really need to find ways to find new solutions to new problems. We have very much a head in the sand attitude. I'm not speaking, my own community would agree with me to say we bury our heads and say, oh, it's not happening, it's not happening. If we don't talk about it, it's not happening. And what we need to do is really bring that out in the fore and open it out for dialogue. And we do need a cross-cultural dialogue, because the problems that we're facing are not necessarily Indo-Canadian problems. They are Canadian problems. And that's why I said my ethnicity is becoming more Canadian. I'm dealing with my children on Canadian issues. Sometimes it's easier for me to deal with the Indo-Canadian issues because I can tell them all kinds of stuff and they don't know, right? So, yeah, that's the truth. Yeah, that's the way it's done. But they're asking me questions about things that they're facing in Canadian living that I have to find new solutions for. So, the family unit being one of the strengths, as I mentioned to you, one of our strongholds, is actually becoming a problem, in a sense. I wouldn't say in a large sense, don't get me wrong. There is internal issues that we need to deal with. There are internal dialogues that need to happen. Doors need to open. People need to give way. My father, I grew up in a fairly liberal household, and my father would always say, be like the willow. Always move with the winds of change and time. Don't be like the oak, because when the wind comes, it cracks in the middle. And I think a lot of cultural communities are much like the oak, because they don't want to let go. And they're afraid to let go. Integration, as easy as the word slips out of my mouth, is a very difficult process. Because as much as we are adopting, we are also giving up. We're also letting go. And our safety and our comfort comes from always hanging on to things that we always have known. How many of us don't want to give up stuff, right? So it is that difficult space, and unless there is support systems, and unless there is education and there is awareness and there is a willingness from the other side, that integration is very, very difficult. In this time and age, integration is quite easy. I feel it's quite easy. There's lots of places to dialogue, there's lots of places to go get help for. But I would say for the first group of people that came in the early 1900s, it was probably the most difficult. And at some level, I went to a conference once with the large Mennonite community, and they said, when I talked about issues of race and racism, and they said, we face some of these ourselves, but we've forgotten how to be allies with each other. We've buried our own past. And of course, as difficult as our past is, that's how deep we bury it. Because we don't want to resurrect it, we don't want to take it out and give it light. If the limelight is off of me, I lean back. I don't come back into the limelight. What's happening in Ukraine right now, for example, I don't know the complexity of their political system, but for someone to come out and really take a stand, it takes a lot of courage. So when I'm being asked to take a stand, most of us prefer to stand back. But to actually step forward is the more difficult part. There is a lack of, in my subcultural community, there's a lack of leadership. And I don't just mean at the church level, at the temple level, at a political level. I mean on a general level. I mean in the larger community level. There are some leaders we look to, but as we don't want to set them up for a fall either. We want to make sure all people are human, they'll make mistakes. But we need to give credit to people where it belongs and give them the strength to continue. One of our weaknesses in our community is that I don't know if this is true of all communities, but when someone becomes quite popular or vocal or gets out there, there's 10 other people and they're saying, no, don't listen to her or don't listen to him because he's this and that. So there's a lot of political infighting, there's a lot of stuff we have to deal with internally, and yet at the same time, we want to put a good face for the larger community. We want to make sure you understand we are model immigrants, that we are good citizens, that we want to create a better life for our children, that we all work hard, that we don't do this or don't do that. Sometimes I have aged immigrant ministries or people in positions of power coming to me and asking me a question on the community. Why this, with a question mark? Why are Indo-Canadian boys involved in gangs? It's a very large question, and so it requires a thoughtful answer. Some of it is cultural, but a large part of it is just Canadian. It's just knowing that they're facing so many stresses, and there are so many stresses that we are all facing. So to get to that understanding with the service provider or with the government agency requires a very thoughtful process. And that's where I think we lack that ability to have that thoughtful conversation, because we're still trying to prove that we have integrated. There is a large burden of responsibility on immigrants to make the host community understand that we are good people. I hope I'm getting that message across. I'm seeing some nodding, so I'm hoping you're understanding where that burden of proof. However, I also want to say that this burden should be shared. There should be a sharing of this burden to say we all need to come forward, one step forward, so that we can have that dialogue. And I'm not sure if I can tell you, other than university and school where we meet and discuss, how many other times in the year that these dialogues are happening. How many times are we sitting down and speaking to people we don't know about our issues on a very informal as well as respectful I like that Justin talked about curiosity, being curious, wanting to know, out of genuine care, to want to know why you do think this way, why you live this way, why do you do this, why do you do that, out of genuine care. And I understand also that people are afraid to ask the questions, because am I going to offend someone? So actually I'm going to leave some time at the end for us to ask me those questions. And we're almost at the end, are we? So this isn't enough time probably to have the kind of dialogue I would say is very meaningful, very engaged, but I would encourage you very much to meet people who you meet along the way from the South Asian community, who are your neighbors, or you work with, or you go to school with, or your friends, your children are friends with, and be curious. And be curious from in a respectful way. I think if we are not curious about each other, I think we lose something in our living as a community. Then there's almost a rebuffing. There's almost I don't care. It doesn't matter. What you do doesn't matter. I'm not curious. I have no interest. So to show that interest and to find that community connection. I don't know if I should leave 5-10 minutes for questions. 10, 15? Oh, 20 minutes. Okay.
Yeah, so thank you so much,
All right.
Satwinder, and we'd like to open up some opportunity to have this dialogue happen, the two-way conversation. So we've got a handheld mic here, and
There's a gentleman
take
there.
the microphone. So
Yes.
continue.
Okay, thank you.
I'm intrigued, maybe inspired as well, going around Abbotsford. The Caucasian Canadian has a tendency when they retire.
Okay, so let me correct you. Caucasian Canadian is, I am Caucasian as well. So you actually need to say you're people of European origin.
Okay, people of European origin. There's a tendency when they retire to maybe buy a motorhome, move someplace, be a snowbird, whatever. But I quite frequently see buses of what I take to be older Sikh people going in and tying raspberries and generally getting involved, and in my looking from the outside opinion, still making a contribution back into society, whether they're paid, whether they're not, I have no idea. But to me that's challenging, it's inspiring. I think retirement is probably a silly idea. But the way most of us define retirement. So maybe you could explain if you know how that sort of thing works and where it came from.
I always say retirement is a luxury, is it not? And I think we as a country have more luxury than others, right? Who imagined at 65 you could just stop working. So the group you're talking about, let me back up a little bit. About 90% of the berry farms in the Abbotsford region, Chilliwack, Delta, Surrey, Pitt Meadows, Maple Ridge, the Fraser Valley region, are owned by South Asians. And being agriculturists is in our back, just as Dutch people like to farm, we also like to farm. So being in the dirt and owning land is really important to us. And the people, so about when we bought a farm in '89, and previous to '89, in the '90s, we had young people working on the farm, right? So the Canadian story is that until the 80s, every generation of Canadian, not just Indo-Canadian, any Canadian, every generation of Canadians had a connection to the farm. But this new generation actually doesn't have a connection to the farm. There's a large group of Canadians growing up now who don't have a grandparent living on a farm or a parent, or haven't picked raspberries or strawberries. So till the 80s, I remember you could get lots of young people coming to pick strawberries and work on the farm and tie the raspberry canes and do the pruning. Something shifted in the 90s. All we had left, and it could be the economy, right? There was lots of work and the economy was growing, so a lot of young people could get work outside anywhere rather than working on the farm. And so what's left is a really older generation of immigrants who are left for us as a labor force. So there is a challenge all across Canada, not just in the Valley, but we're all across Canada where we can't find proper labor to do the work. So right now, if I look at my own farm, everybody's over 70. But they're mostly immigrants. They would have been here less than 10 years. So that's the only work available to them. They have no access to old age pension. They have no access to Canada pension. So the only living they can create is to work on the farm. Now, in the home country, a person of that age would probably not be working, but they would be living in an extended family unit. The son would have taken over the household maintenance and duties and finances, and the parents are in a retirement phase, and they aren't snowbirding, but they're doing a different type of, meditation, prayer, whatever. It shifts here a little bit because the biggest challenge in Canada for immigrants is the mortgage. You live in ancestral homes, and a mortgage is not something that's common. So you come here, you have to live somewhere, you live in a basement for a while, but first thing families want to do is get a home. So the finances start to become more difficult. So I think parents, I've asked my own farm, I said, are you forced to work? Because there's this tendency to think that old people are forced to work on the farm, and there's a lot of empathy for them, and is it a kind of slavery? A large number of them said, no, I'd like to come out because it's the time, it keeps my bones okay, and I get out in summertime, I get to meet other people. Canadian living is very much in the four walls, right? We don't have communal living. People don't sit in their front yard. If you sat in your front yard, people would be like, oh. Why do you have your lawn chair in your front yard? And in India, everybody sits in the front yard because they want to see the world go by. And they want to talk to their neighbors, and they want to have kids are watched over. And so it's a different living style, right? So a lot of the seniors will say, I love to come working on the farm because then I get to meet other people and get my share of gossip, and it just relieves the mind. And then there's a little bit of money that they can make for themselves or for their family. Don't forget the pooling of resources is really important. As much as we live in a very independent world, 18, go find work, even if it's throwing a newspaper or whatever, make some money, look after your own expenses. In Indo-Canadian culture, interdependence is fostered because we have a cradle-to-grave continuum. We look after you when you're small, you're going to look after me when I'm old. So if the cradle-to-grave continuum gets disrupted, and you stop, there's a break, you can imagine the continuum starts to face challenges. So as a result, people contribute to the household pot even as they're old, even when they're old, just so that there's that continuum. It's the first time in Canadian history that we actually have a seniors' home now, which is a microcosm of society, right? We're also evolving, good or bad, we're also evolving. So that's something that we take pride in, to say that families do live with their parents. Sometimes there's conflict. We're humans. That's not to say everything is hunky-dory and everybody lives in this la-la land of, it's not like that. There's conflict in the home and people find ways to resolve it. There's mediation, there's family members who come in. But I've given you a very complex answer to a simple question, but the seniors that do work contribute to the economy in their own way and to their family, right? They earn some money and bring some money home. So I think it's a nice two-way street.
Satwinder, following up on that, would you be able to talk a little bit about labor law?
Say that again?
Labor law.
Labor law? In what context?
Just in context of persons working on the farms.
Okay. Yeah, so there's been some really good movements in justice on the labor laws. There's been some really good movement. So as you can imagine, we are, the previous speaker was talking about Christians being attracted to issues of, you named a number of things. One of them was exploitation, right? Looking to ways to lessen the exploitation of human beings. It's a human trait. If we can do something less for somebody and find a way, there's people who are out there to do that. So Canada had a system of contract labor, which is where you can hire so-and-so to find 100 people to come work on the farm. So I only deal with you. I don't deal with the 100 people you're going to bring. You can bring whoever you want. I'm just dealing with you. So Canada has had that practice for a long, long time, since the early 90s, even probably before that, since probably the CN rail was being built. So that that rule applied to farm as well. So men, usually men, started a thing called contract labor, where they would tell immigrants, a lot of problems is that immigrants don't have cars, they don't know where to go or how to find work. So the contractor would say, I'll take you in my van and I'll take you here and there and I'll drive you, drop you off. And there was exploitation in that process. As you can imagine, anybody that's vulnerable is open for exploitation. There has been a real tightening of the laws, really supportive, very good tightening of the laws. Some of them based on, not just in this instance, but in many instances based on when there's a crisis and a catastrophe. Unfortunately, that happens. We don't get a stop sign until 10 people die, right? It's that same model. So that's shifted for us. There's been some real tightening of the labor laws. Contract labor is still well and alive. All those greenhouses you see out there, in Delta, you ever driven to the airport or to the ferry? You know, there's more sunshine in Delta than there is anywhere else. That's why all the greenhouses are there. All those greenhouses are manned by, staffed by contract laborers. Because not enough Canadians want to do that kind of work. You know, if we put that out in the newspaper, and by law we are expected to put job postings out in the newspaper, we don't get many responses where people say, hey, I'll come and do backbreaking work every day of the week, sunshine or rain every time. It's just not there. The average age of a Canadian farmer is 56 years old. That's old. Well, I'm 56, not that old. It's old in terms of succession planning, right? There's young farmers aren't coming into the system. So contract labor, the labor laws have really been strengthened, which is good. There's still room for improvement, and depends which government is in power. The NDP does more tightening of the rules, and the Liberals are less tight, so that's just an evolution that will continue. Does that answer your question? Yes. And by the way, there's no stupid question. They're all good questions. You can ask me anything.
You talked a lot about integration. In your opinion, what is the difference between integration and assimilation?
Huge difference. Assimilation is at this end of the spectrum, and integration is at that end. And they don't really meet. So assimilation means assimilitude. Become like means similar. You know, I can't be like you. The color of my skin tells me I can't be like you. You will view me differently the moment I come in front of you. If I open my mouth and have an accent, I can't be like you. I don't eat like you. I don't have faith like you. I can't. And it came from a very old policy. And you heard a First Nations person speak this morning. Assimilation was also thrust on them. It's a very old colonial way of thinking. And you know, the colonizers even went to the countries they colonized and asked them to become like them. So it became it's a very problematic theory, which says you must, assimilation doesn't say that you don't, it does say, be a good citizen like me, follow the laws. Those are all good. Those are all good. Where it gets into problem is when the expectations are from a dominant group towards a minority group that you'll become similar like me. And it just can't happen. And that's so presumptuous to expect that and to want that. And what a loss to our diversity if we were all like each other as well. What we bring to the table, our perspectives, our conversations, our dialogues, how we address problems, how we look at solutions. Nowadays, when you go for a job interview, people are asked, how do you work in a team? What is that about? It's about different perspectives. And if we believe in a higher supreme authority, or whatever you want to call that, then aren't we, in a sense, negating that by saying everybody should be like me? And integration on this side, and integration has many, many pieces. I'm just giving you a very cursory glance at an integration. Integration says, take the good, become a good citizen, follow the laws, contribute to your society, work well, be aware, be informed, vote, do all those things. But it doesn't require me to give up my belief system, my value system, because actually my value system is very good. And that's what gives me courage to face the world. It's very difficult when children go to school and they're ridiculed for something they can't change. Being black or being brown or being something, you can't change that. That's so core to that person's being. And if you take that away from them, the entire being collapses. So integration says, integrate, become this good citizen, and there are some values that they attach to that, but it doesn't require you to change how you believe and what you believe. And our value system shifts and changes anyway, all the time. Some things we always keep the same, but there's always this shift and change. I think that's a healthy thing. I think if we're too narrow-minded and hold our values in just a very narrow frame of reference, then it's to our peril. But if we can change that and integrate that, I'm always looking, I was telling Rachel this morning that in terms of human evolution and where we are in terms of interaction with each other, we are just at the infancy stage. We're not even crawling. We have so much work to do. And we think we've conquered it, we think we've mastered it, we know what we're doing. I feel we have, we're still learning. And there's lots to learn yet, lots to do yet. Does that answer your question? Yes.
Yeah, could you just talk a little bit more about a point you made a little earlier? You addressed one of the problems that I think certainly I often struggle with, and that is the issue of it would appear that there's a fairly large proportion of South Asian youth involved in gang violence. That is something that I'm concerned about. And please correct me if my perception is wrong, that in fact it's no different. I'm quite happy if you do that. But then you also made reference to the issue that this is a Canadian problem that we need to solve together. I'd like you to just talk about that a little bit more, if you would.
Absolutely. Very good question. I want to tell you that the visibility of my skin gives you that perception. When we talk about, like, there's been such a shift in the media response. When we talk about someone who's involved in gang violence, if I said to you, Henry Smith, was found, I feel, and it's just my worldview, that we're not always looking for the ethnicity of that person. Are they Finnish? Are they British? Are they German? Are they this or that? I mean, that ethnicity doesn't come in the media. Usually the media used to say, Indo-Canadian man charged with this, that, and the other. I mean, if they're looking for someone and they want to give a description, that's fine. So in terms of Indo-Canadian young boys involved in gangs, is no more, no less than any other group. There is a visibility issue. We have traditionally not been involved in gangs. This is a new phenomenon for us, and that's why it's a Canadian issue. There is no history, as far as I know, and I could be wrong, there is no history of, like, the Vietnamese community had gangs that came, the triads that came from Vietnam and then created the triads here. We didn't have that history. These gangs are grown here, born here, raised here. So there was no connection to the Indo part, the Indian part of that gang. They were involved in drug trafficking or whatever those issues were on very much a Canadian soil, Canadian geopolitical site, whatever you want to call that, here. So there was no connection to the home country that we could link it to say it's an Indian problem. Where the issue got exacerbated was that, and it's a much more larger conversation about how boys are raised. It's not so different from 20, 30, 40 years ago, where we also, in Canadian context, how we raised our daughters and sons were different. Girls didn't go to higher education, boys did. And that's shifted in our community. Hasn't shifted in our community yet. So that's where the situation got exacerbated, where boys had a lot more access to wealth. They had a lot less expectation for education. And we are working hard to change that attitude. I mean, I personally take that as a crusade for myself to change people I can influence around how we raise our sons. Because our focus has been how we raise our daughters. It always has been our focus. Boys, well, they'll just, they'll sow their wild oats and then they'll smarten up. At 24, 25, the mothers and fathers start saying, son, you need to settle down, find a nice Indian girl and marry her. And he's just been wild up to now. So there is an internal issue. I'm not negating the issue, what you're saying. I'm not negating that we have an internal issue, but in terms of it being an Indo-Canadian issue being involved in gangs, I personally don't think that's true. I think being of Indo-Canadian heritage is the only thing that's different. Everything else is as Canadian as it gets. And it is no more, no less. I would say it's less. We have about 20,000 Indo-Canadians who live in this region, and I don't know what the numbers are of boys I don't know the numbers of how many are involved in gangs, but who've come forward into the court system. It's about 20. So I don't see how that creates this big, we have a large Indo-Canadian gang problem. We have a problem. I'm not negating that, but I'm not saying it's any larger or any less. And I do believe it's a Canadian issue. But there are extenuating issues. I understand there are extenuating circumstances that we need to address. I see them conferring, so the time must be coming for your lunch, and I stand between you and good food, so I do not want to. Oh, one more? One more. There you are.
Thank you so much for what you said, and I've resonated with so many points that you've made, and especially about the richness we can have when we're curious about one another and build relationships with that sense of that. And over the last 15 years, I've been blessed by Indo-Canadian friendships that have really inspired change in my own life. In fact, having a suite in my basement and having my daughter and her husband and her kids there was influenced by one of my very close Indo-Canadian friends.
Makes
It
sense.
inspired me, and it worked great.
The only thing is the Canadian friends telling me, can I arrange my kids' marriages too?
Exactly. Yeah, I wanted to ask you something about the assimilation and integration thing, because what my Indo-Canadian friends are telling me is there's a thing that they're struggling with that I don't have an answer for it, and they don't have an answer for it either. And I think it comes to that when you talked about integration, you talked about, if I got it correctly, you talked about that being a better way to go, and you said that's about take the good, you said follow the laws, vote, participate in culture, but don't lose your values. And what my Indo-Canadian friends are telling me is that a number of their families came to Canada specifically because they were sick and tired of the corruption in India, in government, in the police, and all of this kind of thing, and they loved the notion that in our country, our laws and our values around political process are to keep it pure and free from corruption. And they came here to find that. And there's anger in a number of them because they feel who haven't come with that mindset, who've come bringing the values of India that said corruption was okay and bribery is the way to do it, and it's all about the art of the deal. And there's this sort of two groups, is how they describe it to me.
Sure.
And so how do you, as someone who's much more of an expert than me, can you unpack that? Because I think there's legitimate fear amongst those who are Canadian who say, well, we don't want people with corrupt values getting into our government or getting into our businesses or exploiting labor, as you talked about.
Absolutely.
So how do we deal with that?
Yeah, first of all, don't go live in Quebec, because there's corruption there, right? So, India does not have the corner of corruption. Yes, it has its share of corruption. And yes, the share is larger than other countries, but let's not get it wrong, like we all have our share of corruption, right? So there is a divide. I mentioned to you those 4 cohorts. I have to tell you, those 4 cohorts are almost in separate boxes. I can give you distinctions between how they don't meet. The 4th, 5th generation Canadian who was, grandparents, great-grandparents came in 1904. If you talk to them, they have nothing in common with that immigrant that's coming right now. And so the divides within the community are very strong and very divisive. And I want to come back to that conversation about even within my own community, the dialogue is absent. We are not able to have these discussions because I think if you don't air them and you bury your head in the sand and hope it goes away, it just keeps, it's like that B&E game, you pop up the head of that groundhog, is it? And then another groundhog comes up. We have that recurring problem. I must say, we are a young human race. Yes, we're millions of years old. But in terms of our communication, we're very young. So we are also learning how to have this conversation rather than what you're saying, like, I don't know what to do. I think I hear a lot of Indo-Canadians who say to me, I don't know what to do. But why are we only stuck at that stage? You heard that speaker before saying, don't just say, I should, just do it. Like, let's have those conversations, difficult as they may be. And I'm saying impose our values, but open the value box to say, this is what's expected, this is what... I have to tell you, the sponsorship, the link, I told you the chain, right? You sponsor someone, it is the perfect place to inculcate values of Canadian living. Because when new immigrants come, the families that bring them, that was their role, that was their job, to tell them, this is how we go on the bus, this is what we do when we meet, this is how you go get a job interview. That's starting to defray. We aren't getting that responsibility. And that's a larger conversation about all of us giving up our responsibility. You know, it's not just in the play. It's like we aren't, you remember when teachers were like parents? How far have we come from that? So there's a human evolution around discussion that's missing. Like, I would like that conversation that you mentioned not to be so scary as being, oh, well, I don't want to talk to those people because they're like this and they're bringing this value here. You know, where is that? There is these literally divides. You can split it into pie shape, 4 pies that aren't talking to each other. The second generation, I told you about those kids, they're not talking to their parents. They don't have the same language. And I don't mean just English, I mean Punjabi, English, Hindi, they've got that going on. And then the whole language of parents, which goes like this, right? So just take your problem and multiply it by 100. And unless we have resources and people who are willing to help to unpack those. And the other thing I should mention, you know, when you come to settle in a new country, you have your head down. You're like this. You're working, you're trying to provide food for your family, you're trying to take care of immediate needs. It takes many, many, many years for you to raise your head and look up and say, what's happening around me? If you're undereducated, it takes even longer. If you're illiterate, forget it. It is so complex. So just for people to put up their heads and say, what's happening around me and who's doing what and what should I be doing? It's not. We are still in settlement phase. There's that large cohort of people who are just settling, who all they're doing is working, finding food for the table. I'm not saying it's bad food, it's good food, but that stage, they're not at the stage to have this dialogue. So the one who came in the 40s, 50s is saying, you know, look at those people. So that dialogue is not there. And unfortunately, we don't have enough leaders, and I mentioned to you, there's a lack of leadership in our community for leaders to come forward, to spend the time. The way you, Canadian, us, Canadian, I keep saying I'm an ethnic Canadian too, how we view volunteering is very different from how Indo-Canadians view volunteering. We see it as a very formal stage, fill out a form, tell me what day you'll be here, like they're like, what? So that hasn't happened. For us, volunteering is helping your aunt and your uncle and your cousin, your 5th cousin removed, and the uncle that moved from Cornell down to live with you. That's our volunteering. It's a very different frame of reference. We can't attach the same values, so you can imagine the 4 cohorts, and that's why I bring them up, because it's so critical for us to understand. Everything I talk about, I almost can place within those 4 cohorts. Pose me a question, I'll tell you which cohort they belong to. It's that clear. And unfortunately, the divides are huge. I'm making it more problematic for you. I wanted to bring you solutions, and I'm telling you, I have more problems than I have solutions, but I'm very much an optimist, and I'm always looking for the solution, so I know together we can do it. Does that help? Question? I hope, in some way. It's so kind.
Satwinder, thank you so much for coming and speaking.